Our speaker tonight is Elliott Brennan from the United States Study Centre at the University of Sydney. His subject is the rise of the right in the far right in the United States and its implications for Australia. I need hardly draw attention to the relevance of that topic. In fact, without further ado, I'll hand over to Elliott Brennan.
Good evening, and thank you, Ian, for the kind introduction. And I'd also like to offer a word of thanks to the IAAA. Your contribution to this industry has been invaluable for decades now. And I also had the chance to meet with your wonderful interns just before. I've gotten to know a great many of the alumni of your internship program, and they're truly some of the best and brightest future leaders that we have. And it's so valuable to give them the opportunity to contribute that you do. So thank you. They're really bringing the new ways of thinking to areas like the one we're discussing tonight that demand them. So, far-right extremism. I've noticed that over the past year, I've had the ability to quite quickly depress people in my efforts to convince them that this is a really serious subject, but I'll persist because I think Australia is still fundamentally underestimating the threat posed by far-right extremism and conspiracy theorists, extremist conspiracy theories that are spreading online and spilling out into the streets. I'm going to start with some numbers while the night is young. According to research conducted by the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, the majority of all terrorist activity, all terrorist attacks and plots in the United States between 1994 and 2020, far right has been associated with a majority of them. While Islamic terror has been responsible for a majority of deaths, in 14 of those 21 years, far-right terror accounted for the majority of fatalities. Importantly, there has been a sharp rise in far-right extremism and terror attacks and plots in the past 6 years, to the point where it now accounts for over 2/3 of those recorded attacks and plots. Now to the Capital Insurrection. Roughly 800 people participated in the storming of the Capitol building on January 6, while thousands more gathered at the site. There are now over 400 active investigations into criminal activity on the day. More than 500 federal subpoenas have been issued, and at least 229 people have been arrested. 25 of those have direct links to organised far-right groups and far-right street gangs. The small number of direct affiliations is in part due to the secrecy with which these groups operate, but is also alarming. While these groups are effective at creating chaos and instigating violence, what happened on the 6th of January was clearly something that exists in a much broader segment of American society. The Atlantic analysed a sample of 193 of those who were arrested and found that they shattered the conception of a traditional extremist. A young man who was the traditional conception of an extremist, a young man from a low socioeconomic background. The average age of arrestees was 40 years old, with more than 2/3 over the age of 35. 40% own their own businesses or work in white-collar jobs, and only 9% of those are unemployed. 9% of those arrested are unemployed. Overwhelmingly, those arrested and those that have been charged are white. While, of course, left-wing movements have gathered pace in the wake of the pandemic, the failed insurrection at the Capitol on January 6 shows just how clear and immediate the threat of far-right extremism is in the country. While the new administration takes these issues more seriously than the past, President Biden's inauguration, where he was surrounded by 20,000 members of the National Guard, was a display of just how abjectly the peaceful transition of power, which is often promoted as the linchpin of American democracy, had failed. Today, there are still thousands of National Guard servicemen deployed in Washington, DC, and American intelligence services acknowledge that they will be dealing with the detritus of the rejection of the election results for decades to come, for years to come, rather. For Australia, what's happening in the United States highlights, but also exacerbates the threat here. Damaged information ecosystems and far-right extremism represent clear and present dangers for Australia. Far-right extremism now accounts for as much as 40% of ASIO's caseload, up from 10 to 15% in just 2016. Far-right groups, including neo-Nazis, are increasingly embracing encrypted messaging platforms to organise in secrecy, but have also held very public gatherings, indicating that they are emboldened. The Australian chapter of the Proud Boys has gained praise from its United States leader for videos which show Australian members gathering at the residences and workplaces of their critics and intimidating them. In statements to parliamentary joint committees, both the Australian Federal Police and the New South Wales Crime Commission have testified that COVID-19 has directly driven a rise in right-wing extremism online. And of course, it was an Australian man who killed 50 people and injured 40 more in Christchurch in a spate of attacks at mosques in New Zealand in 2019. Conspiracy theories also exploded over the course of 2020. And while demonstrations with dozens to hundreds of participants look parochial and disorganised, their growth, particularly in Victoria, is serious. With an impending vaccine rollout, the threat of social unrest, violence and terrorism at associated crowded places is real and demands vigilance. Attacks on dozens of 5G towers that were rolled out in the UK and even in New Zealand demonstrate the short leap from conspiracy-fueled extremism to violence and terrorism. The scale and urgency of this challenge does not pale in comparison to those like COVID-19, economic recovery, climate change, or the rise of an authoritarian China. In fact, solving the extremism and linked information crisis is crucial to each. Each requires a level of social cohesion, which is fundamentally challenged by the breakdown of truth and the rise of anti-democratic forces who seek to leverage it. This is the state of play. It's clear that the far right has emerged as a fundamental threat to democracy in the United States and is emerging in Australia. What I intend to do tonight is to get to the question of how we got here. I'm going to cover social media and big tech, the changing traditional media landscape and its economics, the quickening influence of the Trump administration, COVID-19, and conspiracy theories. This is a lot to cover, but it's important to recognise that what we are seeing is the result of a convergence of a variety of woes. Accordingly, solutions need to cover the full gamut. So what is far-right extremism? It's often forgotten that extremism is not necessarily illegal. Far-right extremism is different, but related to far-right terrorism. Extremism is simply the holding of views at the periphery of the political spectrum. In this case, leaning hard towards individual liberties, freedoms of speech and religion, and a disdain for certain actions of big government. In Australia, where far-right extremism crosses the threshold into far-right terrorism, it's currently the subject of a Senate Intelligence Committee inquiry. The far right in both Australia and the United States is diverse in its motivations and grievances, but generally shares a revanchist notion that something is being lost and that it not only needs to be defended, but reclaimed. This can manifest in a mix of nationalism, bigotry, white supremacy, anti-immigration sentiments, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, misogyny, or intense policy-based or general anti-government sentiments. Conspiracy theories leverage many of these same grievances and pull people towards extremism with all-encompassing explanations and the designation of villains. An unequal financial burden, an anti-globalization stance, the perceived largesse of government actions, and racially motivated arguments about COVID-19's origin have already found a strong far-right audience and have pushed others towards violent extremism. There is historical precedent too, for increased receptiveness to conservative and far-right movements in the wake of severe economic hardship. The growth of the Tea Party movement in the United States after the global financial crisis is one example, but a working paper by the Reserve Bank of New York on the subject of the impact of pandemics found a direct correlation between the regional impact of the Spanish flu in Germany in 1918 and voting rates for the National Socialist Workers' Party in Germany in the 1932 and 1933 Reichstag elections. So how did we get to the point that we're at now? In the wake of January 6, one rare silver lining is the chance to ask how things deteriorated to the point that the US Capitol was stormed by violent extremists and ask how Australia can avoid a similar fate. In many ways, Australia is at a similar point to which the United States reached in 2009. This is not to say we have 11 years to avoid calamity. It's clear that the radicalisation pipeline has shortened drastically. and Australian extremists are directly plugged into events in the United States. Rather, the political conversation about far-right extremism in Australia has reached a point the United States reached in 2009. In April of that year, the Department of Homeland Security memo warned that the post-GFC economic conditions, the hardship faced by returned servicemen from the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and the first Black president created the conditions ripe for a surge in domestic terrorism in the country. When the memo was leaked, Republicans and veterans group expressed outrage that the Obama administration, they said, was equating them with terrorists. The Obama-Biden administration quickly bowed to these political pressures, and by 2010, the number of analysts at the Department of Homeland Security monitoring these forces had decreased from 6 to 0. It's only now, after a deadly and failed insurrection and a change in leadership, that the United States is inching out of the post-9/11 praxis and dedicating resources back into the threat of domestic extremism. Australia is at risk of making the same mistake. The Senate inquiry into extremism in Australia, which was originally proposed to focus solely on far-right extremism, has already been beleaguered by partisan whataboutism and a reluctance to use the words right-wing in connection with any kind of violence. America's unpreparedness for the convergence of these forces was on full display on January 6, when, after weeks of very public plotting, authorities were totally unprepared for an insurrection at a building that once a year for the State of the Union is arguably the most well-guarded on earth. The United States will spend decades making up for the lost time after its capitulation to political arguments following the publication of that DHS memo in 2009. While the United States learns from its mistakes, Australia should take notes and leave politics at the door to avoid a similar fate. But it hasn't only been political spats and intelligence failures that have allowed the far right to flourish. 2009 was also the year that Twitter and Facebook well and truly took off. A study for the journal Outbreak analysed over 2 million tweets using the word swine flu and concluded that despite a small amount of misinformation, social media would be an incredibly valuable tool for public health officials in future pandemics. In 2021, the very possibility of mass inoculation is threatened by rampant online misinformation. In 2010 and throughout 2011, the Arab Spring swept the Middle East. Again, it was social media that was praised as a democratizing force to be reckoned with, supposedly putting the power of the fourth estate in the palm of every citizen with a smartphone. In 2020, unfettered conspiracy theories asserting the election had been stolen circulated on social media faster than moderators could keep up with. And now 88% of Trump supporters do not believe that President Biden's election was legitimate. While social media empowered individuals, its speed decimated the 24-hour news cycle and gutted traditional media of its advertising base. To stay afloat, news organisations undertook massive cuts, erected paywalls, and in many cases completely fell apart, leaving a centralised news landscape with little time nor money to cover its rural markets. In an attempt to deal with the endless draw of engagement offered by social media, broadcast organisations like Fox News in the United States and Sky News in Australia accelerated their move away from news and leaned harder into their opinion operations to leverage the reach of social media. This started to happen before my eyes in my former life as a journalist, and particularly as a digital producer at Sky News until 2016. As reported in depth by Business Insider, after a change in strategy in 2019, the digital reach of Sky News Australia nowadays dwarfs that of any other media organisation in Australia. Video editorials targeted at conspiracy theory audiences use terms like the Great Reset and have tens of millions of views online, with a great many of those views coming from the United States. In the lead up to his storming of the Capitol, Jake Angeli, the QAnon shaman, and as he's become to be known, dressed as a Viking, was sharing Sky News Australia content on his personal Facebook page. Sky News was also the destination that Steve Bannon, former President Trump's former campaign manager, chose to give information about the Hunter Biden laptop scandal. While opinion has been elevated, trust in journalism as a profession has been plummeting in concert with financial constraints and the pressure of the 24-hour news cycle. The ability of the media to truly hold the powerful to account has been severely hampered, with often problematic social media pylons a poor substitute. The net result is a democracy that is poorer and a landscape that is ripe for exploitation. The social media vulnerability of democracy was clear by November 2016, when Russia relentlessly promoted fake news about the presidential election on Twitter. And in 2017, when it was revealed that Cambridge Analytica obtained the Facebook data of more than 87 million Americans without their consent and used it to tailor political advertising towards them. Since that time, at the very least, the potential for social media to prompt an infodemic and the rise of organised anti-democratic forces has been clear. These were predictable outcomes, with at the very least half a decade of lead time for preparation. So predictable were they that the far-right extremist groups were far more prepared to exploit them than social media giants and authorities were to respond to them. So how were these once darlings of democracy allowed to turn it on its head? The commercial advantage of social media was etched into regulatory stone at a time when the power of the internet was a distant dream or nightmare, depending on your perspective. Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act of 1996 effectively waives the responsibility of social media companies for the content they host. This is a fundamental difference between traditional media publishers and social media companies. Absolving the internet platforms of the responsibility of publishers has allowed for boundless innovation online and is responsible for the success of today's internet as we know it. But malicious actors have ruthlessly innovated and sharpened their tools of propaganda and recruitment and have taken full advantage of these companies that have all the heft of geo-economic blocks, but for too long have lacked effective oversight. The social media giants like Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube were designed to seek global monopolies. They offer users instant communication across the globe and the prospect of an audience in exchange for the often unwitting handover of personal information, which can be sold on to advertisers. To capture that audience, these companies developed aggressive algorithms that feed users content that would keep them engaged with the platform, often regardless of the effect of that content. This is where conspiracy theories enter the fray. We know that some of the content that is shared on social media is less than socially desirable. The ease of social networking has meant that radical conspiracy theories can find larger, more geographically diverse audiences than they would otherwise. And it has allowed them to catalyze online communication communities into real social and political movements. With these factors in play, the global ecosystem of conspiracy theories has been enjoying a renaissance, edging closer to something akin to singularity around a theory dubbed QAnon. QAnon posits an alleged deep state, a pseudo-religious geopolitical reckoning, a global cabal of pedophiles run by Washington, Hollywood, and Silicon Valley elite, and the direct intent of Donald Trump to blow it all apart. Constituents believe in these claims to varying degrees, but broadly agree that a deep state exists. The malleability of the theory, its growing army of content creators make it a distinctly pertinent and easily hijacked force. Far-right extremists and militia groups in the United States have openly discussed ways they can use conspiracy theories to bolster their ranks. COVID-19, work from home arrangements, financial difficulty, and isolation have led to a surge of internet use, particularly among older generations. Since the dawn of home internet, e-safety campaigns have stressed the importance of educating children, essentially digitizing the 1960s message about stranger danger. Then, as now, however, danger often comes from trusted sources, in this case, online influencers. And QAnon has broad appeal, encompassing older generations less well-versed in detecting false and misleading information online. The underappreciated aspect here is that these conspiracy theories tear families and friendships apart. While the content of conspiracy theories can seem outrageous and trivial, those who are gripped by them do not fall into them overnight. Rather, conspiracy theories embellish from points of demonstrable truth. Take QAnon. Child sex trafficking is real. It's awful, it's alarming, and it's getting worse, and something has to be done about it. This is all true. But conspiracy theorists build superstructures of falsehood around these demonstrable truths for fun, for malicious purposes, and often for profit. Through almost cult-like conditioning, adherents are gradually coaxed deeper and deeper down the rabbit hole as they are rewarded for defending their views against the cautions of their loved ones. The result is a cycle of isolation and radicalization, which creates both a domestic security threat and a social health crisis. In October 2020, Republican members of the House Intelligence Committee declined to attend a hearing on misinformation and conspiracy theories. Had they attended, they would have heard experts plea for more to be done to protect American democracy from the erosion of truth and the imminent potential of violence motivated by conspiracy theories. Nina Jankowicz, a disinformation fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, told the hearing that foreign adversaries no longer need creativity or brute force to be successful. They need only sit back and watch, regurgitating and amplifying that which is already endemic to our society. The cost of entry and level of sophistication to influence American politics has never been lower. In recent years, social media companies have begun crackdowns on extremist organizations and conspiracy theorists. The largest came during the Capital Insurrection, but the damage has been done. Pardon me, the damage has been done. These groups have been radicalized, they have organized, they've met in real life, they've conducted political violence, and they've now flocked to encrypted messaging platforms where they will be immensely difficult to track. And this is where we get to the Trump administration. I've deliberately held off discussing the administration until this point because I wanted to emphasize that what's happening precedes and is much larger than Donald Trump. The Trump administration, however, unquestionably provided a devastating accelerant for these malicious forces. In doing so, it diminished the role of truth in government. This was evident during the 2016 campaign, but was most stark early in the administration when Press Secretary Sean Spicer declared that Trump's inauguration was watched by the most people ever, and Kellyanne Conway defended these assertions as ultimate facts. President Trump himself has told in excess of 20,000 lies during his term in office, and the administration often seemed to delight in trolling more than anything else. Trumpism, as it has come to be known, has degraded the weight with which a president's words are supposed to be heard. President Trump was joking when he suggested people inject disinfectant to combat coronavirus. He was optimistic when, despite knowledge to the contrary, he promised that the coronavirus would disappear overnight. And he simply misspoke when he told white supremacists and far-right street gangs to stand back and stand by when directly asked if he would condemn them. For what it's worth, the Proud Boys printed paraphernalia reading "standing back and standing by." A report from Cornell's Department of Global Development suggested that in 2020, President Trump was the world's leading source of COVID-19 misinformation. Indeed, following his banning from Twitter, Signal Labs, a research firm, reported that misinformation about election fraud fell by 73%. These examples are all part of a loose strategy that the Trump campaign adopted in 2015 and 16, loosely described by former campaign advisor Bannon as flooding the zone with, say, excrement. This strategy takes advantage of the state of a diminished traditional media landscape and an overinflated and under-regulated social media landscape. If there is too much information available, it becomes immensely difficult for anyone to sort truth from misinformation and disinformation, well-intended messages from those designed to do damage. Faced with such chaos, individuals lean towards consuming and believing content with which they agree and which they find most engaging. By speaking to some of the darkest anxieties of white America, Donald Trump energized a crucial constituency and entrenched America's fundamental differences. Trump knows that his tolerance for chaos is unique among the country's leaders, and he used this transgressiveness to bend the Republican Party to his will. He rewarded loyalty and delivered retribution for disloyalty. While he suffered a clear election defeat, he mobilized and energized white voters that many believed were totally alienated from the political process. It's the allure of an energized base and the fear of Trump's condemnation that is driving the Republican Party's continued acquiescence to the protection of his legacy. While the Republican Party tries to have it both ways by condemning the violence of January 6, but not holding Trump to account, and while it harbors willing conspiracy theorists within its ranks and members with explicit ties to far-right organizations, but does not condemn them, these problems will remain intractable. While these problems remain intractable, the threat will remain imminent. The pathway from the nexus of conspiracy theories and organized far-right groups to political violence and terrorism became most evident in Michigan throughout 2020. In June of that year, gun-wielding protesters and militia members stormed the state of Michigan's legislature as it debated extending coronavirus lockdowns in the state. Subsequently, a second session of the legislature was cancelled due to the active threat of further protests and more violence. The protesters took an enormous amount of political power from the notion that they had shut down the political process and for a brief time were controlling the political process. President Trump contributed to this sense when, instead of condemning calls for violence and even executions, he urged the target of the threats, Governor Gretchen Whitmer, to negotiate with those making them. 4 months later, militia members who were at those June protests and emboldened by them were arrested in a terror plot to kidnap Governor Whitmer and to set off bombs around the state. Again, President Trump minced his words, saying he doesn't accept violence, but that Whitmer is doing a terrible job and should thank him for the federal arrests. This is the prospect security officials in the United States are now faced with on a national scale. Thousands of emboldened rioters returning from Washington, D.C. on January 6th to every state in the country with a sharp sense of loss, a level of emboldenment, and the idea that they are now battle-hardened and in possession of a new level of organisation. They believe President Trump is still on their side because he keeps telling them as much. To put it bluntly, January 6th was just the start of a protracted national security nightmare, and it would be naive to assume that Australia is immune. While my goal tonight was to outline how we got to this point, I want to finish on 3 broad steps Australia should take. To start to effectively prevent the spread of far-right extremism, conspiracy theories, and misinformation, Australia needs to consider its role in working against the conditions that allow them to fester. This work needs to include efforts to ensure the integrity and health of a diverse media ecosystem, mechanisms to ensure transparency in government, and e-safety education which is fit for purpose, rather than being deployed through the primary and secondary education sectors, omitting older generations of Australians. The United States is on the precipice of a once in a lifetime regulatory effort against big tech. Australia should seek input. While many big tech firms are located in the United States, their reach and outlooks are global. Australia should use the Biden administration's ambitions for the restoration of global democracy to elevate conversations about how undemocratic and dangerous forces spread online. The EU, New Zealand, France, and several other nations have already worked together on similar issues. It would be in Australia's interest and within its historical role as a facilitator of such cutting-edge dialogues to lead these conversations with the United States and the world. The advanced threat of far-right terror is now clear. Australia should glean insights from the massive domestic security operation underway in the United States. Australia should accordingly embrace its own efforts to fully understand the nature of this threat, including listing far-right groups on the terror register. Without a public discourse that unequivocally treats these groups as the threat they will remain emboldened. Thank you for your time, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you enormously, Elliott. And we now have a nice generous period of half an hour for questions, both from the floor here and from people online. I hope you've been flooding us with lots of questions using the Zoom Q&A function, but if not, it's not too late. Please direct your questions to us as soon as you like. Do we have a question from right here at Glover Cottages? Please.
Nice speech. 3 times you mentioned the failed insurrection on the 5th of January. My understanding of the insurrection is an armed attempt to take over the government. It was a riot, it was wrong. I'm no Trump supporter, but I really do think it's an overstatement to call it an insurrection. Can you defend the fact that you did that?
Of course. It is a topic that's been hotly debated, how to refer to what happened on the 6th of January. Some people have gone with riot, some people have gone as armed uprising. But from the facts, and as the definition you laid out there, a great deal of those protesters or insurrectionists, as I would contend, were there to stop the political protest. They were armed and they were there to serve that purpose of stopping the certification of an election, which is an essential part of the democratic process. There were disparate goals among them.
They were trying to interfere with a reasonable Congress. but to take over the government, which is an insurrection. That's the issue I've got with the definition that's been thrown about.
I understand. What did happen was that the government ceased to function as it was for a short period. That was certainly the goal of at least, we have dozens now charged with these sorts of crimes with those goals. I emphasize failed because, of course, it was not successful. That night, the government continued its work. So it's more a statement of motivation. And that's why I do preface it with failed. I don't think it was a successful insurrection. For a brief period, I think it looked like it could go that way. We learned during the impeachment trial that many members of the government were seconds away from people who were there with the express desire, in the case of Vice President Michael Pence, to hang him. That's what people expressed their desire. We're here to get Pence. So that's why I feel comfortable using that language, but prefacing it with failed.
Thank you.
We have a question from online from Rafaela Bayless Wong, and the question is, why has there been such a rise in far-right extremism compared to other ideologies such as far-left?
Yeah, so there have been patterns in the rise of extremism, referring here to the United States. The period between roughly 2000 and 2005 was a period that did see a rise in far-left extremism, which can be environmental groups, different attacks that Australia hasn't really seen on the scale, but on industrial farming in the United States. The conditions in the United States at the moment have really been primed for this sort of movement, and it's particularly been accelerated by in the 2016 campaign, the way that the Trump campaign did away with a notion among the Republican Party that was, we need to appeal to a broader base of voters. President Trump correctly identified that there were people in the United States, and a great deal of them, who were not happy with the way things were going and sought a return to the way things were. And that's what was activated. I think as well, social media and the algorithms that I referenced in the speech have really benefited the far right much more effectively than they have the far left. When people talk about Antifa as an organization, members of Antifa fundamentally distrust each other and are just less, they certainly have extremist views. I never walk away from that, but they're less effective at organizing. And it has to do with their political views of anarchism, that they simply don't trust each other enough to organize effectively. So all those sorts of things have to do with the reason that we're seeing far-right extremism, organized far-right extremism, more pronounced in the United States now than the left.
Thanks. Is there another question from the floor? Alice.
Hi, so I was wondering that senators including Josh Floyd and Ted Cruz were vocal opponents of impeachment proceedings and have all been identified as presidential candidates for 2021. To what extent do you think, or even in some way empowering this sort of extremist ideology is going to be essential for the positions of this?
Yeah, it's the Republican Party had a lot of soul searching to do after January 6th, and they've landed somewhere in the middle. We had a vast majority of the Senate vote to see the election legitimately, whereas the House voted in substantial numbers to not honor that. So the Republican Party is split at the moment, and it's between traditional stalwarts like Mitch McConnell, who's seeking to keep the base that Trump has energized, but return to more traditional Republican politics, as opposed to those, like you mentioned, Senator Hawley and Cruz, who seek to inherit the political legacy of Donald Trump. I think they will run into significant obstacles, just being in that they lack the charisma that Donald Trump possesses. They lack the Trump name. and what's become just abundantly clear over the last 4 years is that the Republican Party is Trump's. 88% of Trump voters saying that they don't believe the Biden election win was legitimate, but 90% of Republican voters saying that they believe Donald Trump will run in the next election. So they've got significant obstacles to overcome if they wish to continue that legacy. The largest being they don't have the surname Trump.
We have another question from our online viewers. This one is from Ellis. The question is, I think there are hard considerations to face up to, and that the problems of misinformation in legacy media, social media platforms, and nakedly corrupt politicians like a Trump have exploded because so many of the people exposed to what are arguably the most outlandish of ideas from these streams seem to eat them up uncritically. How is it that we can fix this problem without engaging with the long, hard task of investing in a society to make sure citizens are not educated enough to be savvy, critical thinkers and not knee-jerk extremists and suspiciously cynical skeptics?
We have the misfortune of being a bit pessimistic. I think it needs to be a long, hard slog to correct these problems. It starts in Washington this year with the regulation of big tech giants. There's a huge opportunity there to really set a foundation that was not set in the 1990s for the way that the internet should operate. It's an incredibly complex problem. One of the wonders of the regulatory space for the internet at the moment is that it allows this innovation, and it has done many things that are demonstrably good. That's something that was not present in my speech, but social media has and is capable of being a force for good, but it's also capable of being a force for ill. And so this process starts in Washington, and even that's not a quick process. It's not like the consensus in the United States between Republicans and Democrats that something needs to be done about that Section 230 will result in a quick solution. That could take up to 5 years of legal challenges, of back and forth. And we've seen how much can happen in 5 years. So I'm concerned about the future, but I think there are concrete steps that need to be taken. When you have publicly elected officials jeopardizing public health campaigns, something needs to be done to get out that that's not the behavior of an elected official. That's incumbent on governments. The United States is struggling with that at the moment. Australia is testing the waters at the moment, but that's a step to start. As I said, I think e-safety needs to be reconsidered. Educating school children about the internet is important, but we now have almost total uptake of the internet by the global society. And so that omits anyone that was born after the 1990s for genuine e-safety education and the pace at which the landscape evolves. So efforts like that being undertaken by Telstra, its advertising campaign around 5G is really helpful, but it shouldn't be left to the private sector alone to conduct these efforts. And for Telstra, there's obviously a commercial driver there, which is they want to roll out 5G, and they see this as a fundamental threat to their ability to do that, given that 5G towers have been attacked across the world. But we need more than commercial incentives for the private sector. We need really democratic incentives for countries like Australia and the US that are going to be worse off if we don't leave everything unchanged.
Another question online?
I'll just jump in really quickly.
Sure.
I share your concern, really deeply share it. 50 million Americans don't trust the recent election, which is diabolical. That's going to fester, and it's a real major drama. If you were Joe Biden, what steps would you take to try to change that? And I don't know the answer. I'm just hoping you might come up with some.
The Democratic Party is similarly split to the Republican Party. They're torn between really the bipartisanship, which seems to course through Joe Biden's blood, but also really accounting for what's happened in the last 4 years. And so that party as well is tearing in different directions. I think, unfortunately for the Biden administration, while you do have, say, Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, who even when pushed, wouldn't really walk away from conspiratorial views, such that there are crisis actors at school shootings or that no plane flew into the Pentagon. While you have those people in elected office that are not rebuked by their own party, it's incredibly difficult to deal with. And this, again, is an area where I'm just unable to be optimistic so long as those factors are in place. There is obviously, as you mentioned, a large tens and tens of millions of Americans who at the moment feel incredibly angry at the result of the election and don't trust it. They don't trust media. They don't trust the other side of the political spectrum. And it's an enormous problem for the United States. At the US Study Centre, we did comparative polling of Australians and Americans. And we used a range of different questions to assess people's political views, where they sat on the political spectrum without asking them. Because if you ask someone to designate where they lie on the political spectrum, they have their own ideas. But what we found was that the median Trump voter, the median coalition voter in Australia shared more in common with a Clinton voter in the United States than they did with a Trump voter. There is absolutely no overlap between the left and right in the United States. There is this huge partisan gulf, and bridging that is immensely difficult, especially with all these factors left in place. I mean, it's going to be long, slow, and painful.
So there's no silver bullet here. So.
No. Again, and this is why I went so broad in the address, is because you can't address just one problem. All of these factors are cropping up at the same time. And to do anything about them, you need to deal with them all at once. And that's why I think what happened in the wake of the Capital Insurrection will prove to be more effective than previous responses, because at once you had social media companies deplatforming these individuals, which can be problematic as well. I'm not totally on board for deplatforming, but in this case, I think it was necessary, as well as a judicial effort to really show that this is not something that's acceptable. So you really have to deal with these all at once, and I don't see a capacity right now for that to be effectively done.
Okay, we have another question from online, and this one's from Brian Everingham. And the question is, for years, the security forces have ignored right-wing homegrown extremism in the USA and in Australia. Indeed, there is evidence that both military and police forces have been radicalized to the right without any effective controls. How can this be rectified?
Yeah, so this is something that cropped up following January 6, where the National Guard was required to guard the inauguration of President-elect Joe Biden. But there were genuine concerns that members of that National Guard were of the same belief systems as many of those who stormed the Capitol. And I think dozens of guardsmen were removed from their posts because they showed evidence that they did associate with these kinds of forces. It's a really massive problem in both Australia and the US. It's often referred to as the war coming home. People with severe experiences in war zones, as well as a culture that is being investigated in Australia quite thoroughly at the moment. So there are steps being taken to deal with this, but it's another one of those areas where it's been unexamined for so long that it really has gotten to a point where potentially you had a threat to a president at his inauguration from someone who was there ostensibly to protect him. So again, another long, hard process that demands cooperation and the putting aside of political arguments. No one is saying that to undertake that sort of work, that you're undercutting the value of military service. It's just dealing honestly with what is demonstrable within the ranks of those services.
And we have another question. This one's from Rachel Bell McDonald. What are the implications of Trump's failed conviction in the most recent impeachment trial? And is this likely to add fuel to the fire after witnessing this impunity?
Yes. basically, even before Donald Trump ran for president, he'd been running for president since the 1980s. It was he's constantly backgrounding reporters, telling them that, oh, you know, thinking about politics and generating this media interest around himself. Keeping that alive for 2024 is going to keep the Republican Party in his palm. It's quite clear that Trump is the leader of the party, regardless of the election. And without conviction, it means that he is fully eligible to run again in 2024. Twitter came out recently and said it would keep its ban permanent and wouldn't reinstate Trump to Twitter if he did run for political office again, which begs the question of how effective would a Trump campaign be without its social media arm. But I think until that point, whether he says he runs or not, he will continue to be the de facto leader of the Republican Party, but he will also be held up in the views of those who have been radicalized as someone who still supports them. He's had ample off-ramps really over the last few decades to dismiss with these forces. It's important to remember that his genuine political run started with Obama birtherism and that conspiracy theory. He's had options at multiple points throughout his political career to condemn these forces, but he's never seen it in his political interest. And I don't see, particularly after these events, why that would change between now and 2024.
Any more questions from here in the room?
Yeah, so thank you for your talk. You've talked about the regulatory task of handling social media and disinformation on social media. But how difficult do you think the task is of stemming far-right news organizations like Fox News, One American News, Newsmax, especially in Australia, like Sky News, and the push towards far-right views on those platforms? Do you think there's a role in government in kind of stemming kind of media concentration and stemming the rise of very partisan political platforming?
I'll quickly touch on concentration. I think it is important that the media ecosystem is diverse. But something else I would say, and that I'm watching quite closely at the moment, is in the United States, the legal response to what's happened. So election voting machine companies suing Fox News, suing One American News, suing Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell for their false claims about their businesses. So there is a prospect, and the claims are enormous. I think Fox News is hundreds and hundreds of, perhaps billions. It's an enormous figure that's so big that it just didn't compute and stay in my brain. But it's enormous, and it's something that would even have consequence for an organization as large as Fox News. So this has reached a watershed moment, and I think it will be interesting to watch how effective that is. Some of the smaller organizations, like Newsmax, now carry a card. The presenters carry a card that anytime one of their guests starts spreading misinformation about these companies that have sued them, they stop them and start reading a legal statement from the card saying, we have no evidence to suggest that this, that, or X, Y, or Z happened. So that's a really interesting inflection point at the moment. And of course, I think a diverse media ecosystem should be supported. But I think let's see where this legal approach goes before talking about government intervention.
Okay, so we have a few questions online that are coming through around the same theme. I'll read one of them out, and that is, could you comment on the similarities with and differences from the circumstances that led to the rise of fascism and Nazism in the 1930s?
So I'm a history major, but not Nazism. Focus on Australia and Indonesia in that regard. So I wouldn't really dabble too much in that. Just one of the things that is now coming to light a lot about Nazism was its centrality, the centrality of conspiracy theories to its growth. And a lot of the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that are spreading nowadays draw actually from those same texts that were circulated in the same era. So there are not only similarities, but actual source material that is exactly the same as was in that time frame. But I wouldn't go too much further at the risk of offending historians in the area.
Any more from here in the room?
So, back.
Please.
About 15 years ago, that great American philosopher Homer Simpson said, "I'm a white American male aged 35 to 55, and everyone wants to know what I think." To what extent is right extremism, I guess, the last gasp of that white male supremacy?
Yeah, it's central, and it's really it's enormous. There is a sense, including among younger generations of white Americans, that something is being lost. So the University of Chicago does bi-month polling every 2 months on a huge segment of young Americans and ask them about a number of different things. But one of the questions they ask them is anti-white racism equal to or worse than racism against other minority groups? And repeatedly over the last 5 years, young white Americans, particularly males, have been about 50% of them say, yes, it's getting to that level. So there is a real sense, particularly like not just in older generations, but even among younger generations of white Americans, that political correctness, for example, has gone too far, or, you know, Black Lives Matters was a threat to democracy in America as well. And whenever you have large movements, you also have reactions to them. And I think that's why what we're seeing at the moment is so intense. Black Lives Matter is a response to something quite intense. This is a response to that, as well as a sense that something real is being lost among those communities.
Thanks for the presentation, Elliott. And I'd like to ask the question of political correctness. Do you believe that it is important? While freedom of expression is an important value in our societies, do you think elected officials and those in authority particularly should be politically correct to ensure that the far right is not emboldened to act out on their political views with potentially violent consequences, as we've seen in some cases?
Yeah, I do generally believe that you should always be conscious of what you're saying and the impact it could have on people who are listening to you. I think that's a fundamental responsibility that comes with any platform. So of course, I think it's central to leadership in Australia and around the world. Sensitivity, Australia likes to hold itself up as a multicultural society. I think central to upholding that is appreciating what makes that so special. The reaction to political correctness in Australia and the United States is at this point time-honoured. It's been happening for decades, and it's often used as a scapegoat. Like, political correctness has gone too far. It's identifying one thing as the source of genuine problems. Taking the example of the United States, rural white America has genuine problems. It has been neglected. But I think what politicians like President Trump have said the reason this is happening is because political correctness is benefiting urban, which is coded language, urban societies more than it is you. You've been forgotten. So I think there's a confluence of political correctness with genuine societal woes that leads to these sorts of outcomes.
Okay, we have a question from Andy Symington, and the question is, how do we best ensure that extreme views aren't given a platform on traditional media, yet guarantee freedom of expression?
Yeah, there are some great handbooks by misinformation and disinformation and extremist researchers for journalists. I think it's important for journalists to keep up their education. It's another job that you have that has a social responsibility. And there are things around reporting the views of extremists that can actually embolden them. For example, quoting extremists at length, quoting from the manifestos of people who have conducted terrorist attacks, are often used by people swirling around the periphery of them as material that's emboldening. It's their views getting out into the mainstream media. So there are absolutely responsibilities that journalists have in this regard. And it's incumbent on them and their employers to make sure that they're doing this. It hasn't always been the case. I think sensationalism, it's interesting. It is genuinely interesting to see what these views are and see them expressed. But there is a point where they cross the threshold of free speech, which isn't actually protected in Australia like it is in the United States, and into speech that has the potential to incite or could be considered hate speech. So there's an important distinction to be made.
So we have a question from Annette McClintock. How do conspiracy theories such as QAnon, with its focus on the American political elite, translate to and take hold in Australia?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and it does translate actually really well. The core belief of QAnon is that there's a deep state. And again, that's something, depending on your definition of a deep state, you can show government corruption and extrapolate that as evidence of the deep state. So Australian conspiracy theorists, particularly those in the QAnon influence, absolutely believe that Australia is implicated in this global cabal. They believe that the UK is implicated. And again, these views are so, I describe it often as like a bathtub. If you had QAnon at the center, you have all these different conspiracy theories swirling around towards QAnon. So saying that QAnon adherents believe X is never going to be an accurate statement, but there are certainly things in Australia that they incorporate from the US, but also importantly that they feed back into the US. One of the things that happened during the Australian bushfires was that the US conspiracy theory community was set alight about conspiracy theories about deliberately lit fires in Australia to create underground tunnels for the exploitation of children. It's one of those things where it's a cross-fertilization enabled by the technology that we have today. So, I mean, you watch the news in Australia, particularly while President Donald Trump was the president, you can't escape from American politics in Australia. It's something that we are glued to, and it's likewise for conspiracy theory communities.
Thank you very much, Elliott. I'm definitely not getting in a bath with QAnon. Please. Our new interns, our new 6 interns began their duties tonight, this being our first event of the year. One of them's Alice Nason, who's majoring in international relations, politics, and American studies at the University of Sydney. And we now invite Alice to move a vote of thanks.
On behalf of the Australian Institute of International Affairs, New South Wales, I would like to thank Elliott for taking the time to speak to us this evening. As observers and analysts of international politics, experiencing this critical juncture for America following the events of January 6th and the recent impeachment proceedings, it is pivotal that we understand and grapple with far-right extremism. You have provided us with a renewed understanding of the trajectory of this phenomenon, a cautionary tale for Australia, as well as a constructive reflection of how far we've already gone. We hope that both the US and Australia moving forward can be successful following your advice at confronting unregulated tech, their society's normative understandings around the sources of threat and justice, and our leaders' tolerance for chaos. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That brings our event to a conclusion. Many thanks to all of you, both at home with your Zooms and here with us tonight. It's very good to have your support, particularly after the difficult periods we've all been through, and it's not over yet. Look forward to having with us again in 2 weeks for our next event. Meanwhile, good night.